History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Julia Weiner, author of our very own novel, The Wretched and Undone. Julia, welcome.
Thank you so much. Good morning.
Well, I want to start with the background for this novel. It's a family saga. We have a generational saga. So, can you talk about the family of the Onderwalds, who they are, and did you create them completely out of your imagination, or are they based on your own family? How does that work?
Well, what's really interesting is I think I wrote this book a little bit in reverse from a timeline perspective. In my own family, we had a good old Texas ghost story on a ranch that my sister bought some time ago on the banks of the Medina River in Bandera County, right off of Texas Highway 16. And they were spooked. There was a ghost on their ranch, and whether you believe in ghosts or not, I believe my sister and her story. And so I started to think about this novel, or at least early days thoughts about this novel. And then I wondered, well, who's the ghost? How did she get there? What's the backstory? And as I unwound that, I discovered in a place that I visited so many times such a rich history, a rich Texas history, a rich US history that took me back to 1854 because there's a stone, a granite monument right in front of the little Catholic church in town. And it has the name of 12 families, and the Anderwalds are one of those 12 families. And I realized they all came over in 1854 on a steamer ship from Bremen, Germany, and docked in Galveston, made their way to Bandera, and built this tiny scrap of a town in the middle of nowhere with nothing.
Can you go a little bit more into the setting of the novel because you've taught well, it takes place in Texas Hill Country, and it seems like it's a place that is important to you. But I've never been to the region. I live in Minnesota, so what's the value of the setting and why is it important?
Sure. I'm really shocked you have not been to the cowboy capital of the world, which is how Bandera talks about itself. It was a node on the Chisholm Trail and the southern tributaries into the Chisholm Trail in the early days of the cattle trade, and was a hop-in sort of juncture in that travel thoroughfare from Galveston and other ports north towards Fort Worth and other stockyards in the middle of the country. So it had this really interesting history. It also was in the crucible of the back and forth between the North and the South during the Civil War. There's a small fort called Camp Verde, which is just north of Bandera and is a storied place where a couple of things came together. One, it was a U.S. Army outpost, and then it became a Northern Army outpost, and then it was overtaken by the South. But what existed there was what's called the U.S. Camel Corps, and they had brought camels over from the former lands of Arabia, as they used to call them, along with this group of camel wranglers who were Arab, who came over with the camels to take care of them. And they batted back and forth between the two armies. And so it was this really interesting place in a time during the American Civil War, certainly during the US Native American conflicts in the region, particularly with the Comanche. It was a hotbed of activity along Bandera Pass and that part of history. And then it really died out over the early part of the 20th century because the railroads went around, like many small towns in Texas. But it had this rich history and it had this devoted, sort of intrepid pioneer cohort, many of whom lived into the 20th century and told tales of founding this town. And so it was just really intriguing to think about it. It's also one of the most beautiful places on the planet. If you've ever been to the Texas Hill Country, it takes your breath away the first time you see it. And many of my first impressions are woven into the text of the book of this place and time.
I've been to San Antonio. How close is that to the region we're talking about?
Well, by car, kind of 30 to 40 minutes now. But it takes you into the early rolling hills of the Texas Hill Country, coming out of San Antonio and into the Hill Country. So it's a really beautiful patch of territory as you drive up.
You talked about the Camel Corps. You talked about the family, the Onderwalds that came over in 1854. So this, not well, some surprising elements aside from the ghosts in this novel, but it's parts of history that I don't think a lot of people are familiar with. And that's kind of where the novel starts off with the Onderwalds coming, establishing themselves in the region, and then the patriarch of the family having to serve as a soldier
Mhm.
and being a part of that Camel Corps. Can you talk a little more about the Civil War history of this region and how your character plays a role in it?
Sure. So, a huge part of the founding immigration wave that came to the area was coming from Poland, and it was coming from Germany. There are dotted towns all over the area where you have small Polish churches and small German churches, and names from many, many generations. So it was this confluence of immigrants who came on the eve of the Civil War who had no idea what was going on or the context for the conflict. So that was one sort of aspect to this. During the time as the South kind of moved into Texas and Texas aligned with the Southern Army, there was a scramble for manpower. It was a little dire out on, yeah, as you moved further west in terms of troops and support for the Southern Army, and so there were some conscription efforts by the South, some more draconian than others, and so they moved throughout the town, and if they found men of fighting age, and it was from quite young to quite old as you think about it, they were often conscripted either formally into the army or as adjunct to and in service of the Southern forces. And that's really what Marchin Anderwald, the character, who is fictional but based on people at the time in the place, is brought on as an expert carpenter and wood worker to help build special kind of wagons for these camels. And so that's the tale of how he comes to Camp Verde. So he was not enlisted formally, but he was brought as a in service of the men at Camp Verde. There's also a story there at the time that when the South took over, there were a number of prisoners of war from the North that were kept at Camp Verde and deployed either as workers during the time in which they were waiting to be sent back, either to join the South or to be sent home. There were some not attractive acts of violence against Northern soldiers at the time, prisoners of war in particular, but also there was a notion of bushwhackers who were people who were avoiding joining the Southern cause. And many of them were hunted by not official parts of the Southern Army in that period of time too.
Let's talk about the genre. This novel is a little bit of a departure of from what we publish at History Through Fiction. Um, I don't. Maybe it's not a departure, but it doesn't. It's a kind of broadens what we publish. So, what? How would you define the genre, and maybe what are some comparable titles that would be familiar to readers who like this genre?
Sure. So this is smack dab in the lane of Southern Gothic, which has both historical, it has regional, and it has horror elements to it that come together. And there is also usually a heavy dose of supernatural, at least a tip of the hat to the supernatural in the Southern Gothic genre. I think it's different than things that are set in the American Southeast. It's very Southwestern in its flavor. And I think where it overlaps in subgenre is in Texas noir, which is an emerging, really becoming very popular genre of writing as well. It's not a crime procedural or a murder mystery per se, but it does overlap a little bit with that Texas noir vibe. So that's the way I would classify it. But when I think about what are the comparables, it's really a mashup. And it's, Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian and some of the tough truths and also the supernatural. And there's a lot of religiosity in the book too, which we could talk about if you wanted to. I think it's also, speaking of religiosity, but also family and conflict of conscience and generational, the way generations work with each other in complicated families. I think about Marilyn Robinson's Home or Gilead. She is also a huge inspiration to me as a writer. And then it's got a little dose of the Coen brothers. If anyone's seen the movie The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, there's one where a miner digs for gold and ends up digging his own grave, which is really interesting. And then there's also the guy who's being hung in one of the stories, and he turns to the gentleman beside him on the gallows. He goes, "Oh, is this your first hanging?" Because people have tried to hang him a couple times before unsuccessfully. So it's a little bit of that tongue in cheek, but really bringing together those other sort of very literary historical fiction or literary fiction that I think of Marilyn Robinson in that lane, and then the sort of literary but historical and also Texas-based Southern Gothic that I think of with Cormac McCarthy.
Let's dive a little bit more into the craft while also sharing some of the wider history, because we did talk about the early history of the novel and the Civil War, but this is a generational story that goes all the way to World War One. Talk about weaving all of that together while also sharing some of the technological changes, sharing the events in or changes in world events and viewpoints on things. Like it covers a large span of history. It was a lot to weave together. So talk about those challenges and how you managed to do that.
In terms of how I thought about this book, one of the hardest things to do was to create a tight story over this expansive time that also allows the characters to live and to flourish in their respective parts of the novel. A fair bit of the original draft of this novel ended up on the cutting room floor to accomplish that end. And the way that I thought about that is to really be very specific about the characters and how we were going to follow them over the generations. And so I focused on Marcin in the first generation, who is the first arrival with his wife Agnieszka, and then his son and Zacharias, who marries Liza and their family, and then ultimately John Marcin, their one and only son, and to trace the curse and its impact over these generations. I think that with that flow, you see how the world is changing at that time, both in terms of the immigrant experience and themes of assimilation and how that works, and a longing for home country, a longing for staying true to your core values and your faith, but that does dissolve a little bit over the generations. You see a difference in the way the characters view the world. There's a sense in Marchin's generation, it is God's will, and I must do my best to be on the right side at the end of my life. Whereas with Zacharias, there's a real challenge to the notion of a benevolent God that would visit such pain and anxiety and angst, or not anxiety, but pain and angst on this family, or maybe anxiety too, to a final third generation that doesn't go to church and just has a different sense of how you think about right and wrong in the world. And so you see that theme. You also see the theme of country. What does country mean? Marchin says, "I don't understand this war between the North and the South. What are you fighting for? But I'm just going to keep my head down." You see Zacharias, who finds that the lack and the lack of justice in the wake of the Civil War was a really angry, awful time in Texas, and there was a lot of bad stuff that happened, and it happened to one of his friends, and he seeks justice and is trying to figure out in this untethered world that really lived in the last part of the 19th and early 20th century. But then you see this resurgence of and a sense of nationalism that comes up with John Martin and his desire to join the forces in advance of the First World War down on the southern border, and his real sense of obligation to his new country. So there are those themes as well. You also see a little bit on the women's side, sort of the quiet, um, support your husband, do what he needs, through to very independent women who love these men too, and that they also represent an evolution in how never a diminution of the strength that women brought to the enterprise of family at this time and over time, but it's a different way in which they articulate that and in which they uh, demonstrate strength and weakness. That I think is also a theme.
Music is highlighted in this novel. Can you tell us a little bit more about the music and why that plays a role in the novel itself?
Yeah. Well, some of the story that started this cascade back in time of research and really writing in reverse started with my own family, who are musicians, an extended family of musicians who, and just growing up with a father who we never went to summer camp. He bought an old camper and we went from bluegrass festival to bluegrass festival to bluegrass festival. So that music has always been part of my life. And it is like a sound, and I think of music as a soundtrack to different parts. We all have signature songs that remind us of times in our lives. So it started there, and Bandera is actually a really important place on the music scene. There's an old honky tonk there called Arky Blues, which used to be called the Silver Dollar Saloon, which used to actually be called the Foxhole way back in the day. I wove that into the story. The Arky Blues and the Silver Dollar are actually characters as much as anything else in this book, but those are stops any emerging Americana or country music artist makes as they're building their career. They come to Bandera, and oftentimes they come back to Bandera to play that music. So music is a really big part of just Bandera culture and history right now, through this amazing place that's down beneath the street. Again, called Arky Blues today, but it was the Silver Dollar. Uh, and so that started it. And then as I thought about soundtrack of life and went back in time, there are some really signature moments, particularly as the book rounds the 20th century, where the region plays a significant role in the evolution of country music, what from folk through to kind of modern country. And the character of Anna, who is the love interest and a major female figure in the third part of the book, is a musician and a singer. And so that's how music was infused in, and and a really important part of the book.
Let's talk about you for a little bit. This is your debut novel. Did you always see yourself as a novelist? How did that develop over time that you came to write this novel?
Sure. No, I did not always see myself as a novelist. I've had several different careers, the first of which started out as being trained as a Russian historian. And so that's where my bent for history. I also had a minor in college in Russian histories. You might notice a few Russian history uh, tips of the hat, at least in terms of theme and tone. There's one chapter called The Brothers Anderwald, which is definitely directly from the Brothers Karamazov. But just so there are some little hints along the way. Also, just really always interested in research and oral history and memoir. That was something that I did a lot of work in when I was a graduate student. So that's where I started. Then I had a side hustle teaching English as a second language for a Jewish community center up in the Bronx when I was a graduate student to make some extra money. And I became really intrigued and got the opportunity to meet and interact with a generation of new immigrants to the United States, mostly from the former Soviet Union. and I found myself teaching English to people who fought the Nazis. And I'm thinking, this is just surreal. So surreal that I'm sitting here teaching them how to conjugate verbs and, maybe being frustrated at one point in time and then asking them to tell me their stories and just realizing the rich history that they brought to bear there. Um, I came west to California and took up another job, which is I do fundraising for university, and that also was an exercise in storytelling. All along, I had in the back of my head, I want to write my own stories someday. And so, for a birthday present a few years back, my husband uh, so enrolled me in a course, continuing studies course at Stanford University called How to Start Your Novel and Keep It Going. And in that class, I wrote the first chapter of this book, and it was just a tsunami from there of waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning before I had to be at work and writing until the wee hours of the night for a few years.
And when you did finally land a contract to have your book published, tell me a little bit about that process, because I mean, I know from because we worked on this with you that there's still a lot of work that had to be done, and I think that's something that a lot of first-time authors aren't aware of, how much work goes into after you get accepted for publication. So can you talk about that work and some of the challenges of it, and maybe some of the things that you've learned throughout?
Well, if I'm being honest, the journey of pitching your book to agents and publishers alike is a little soul sucking, I have to say. And you have to build up emotional and emotional scar tissue pretty darn quick because there are not a lot of yeses out there. But when you wrote to me and said you wanted to work together, I would want it ranks right up there in one of the happiest days of my life, I have to say. And I do want to do a shout out to you, Colin, and team because it's been an incredible experience. And if there's a if there's a shout out I can give to the small press experience, and I would like to do that because I think that has been really positive, even though it's been a lot of hard work. So that it just took a lot of knocking on doors until someone said yes. In an early times, someone said it just takes one yes, and that's absolutely true. But it's nearly feels like a million no's before you get there. So it's stay focused, stay constant, stay confident, um, but also, seek feedback like why is this not landing, how could this be better, from people who don't know you and love you, because the people who know you and love you are going to tell you everything you do is fabulous usually, particularly when you want it to write. So I think that's the first lesson learned. The second is, I remember I sent out your press release to a few of my friends, and they're like, I can't find your book on Amazon. I'm like, oh, there's, I've signed a contract. Now we have to get down to the real work. And it was pretty much a year to the date of signing the contract and then having um, the first sort of advanced copies ready to go. And that was a lot of work because it has to be there's an art. It is a science, but there's more art than science to this. And I think you have to surrender yourself to that process. Again, uh, another time in which you have to build up some scar tissue because you're going to hear things you don't want to hear. You're going to have to leave characters on the floor that you love and adore. You're going to have to leave scenes that you remember spending 3 months writing that just don't fit the flow of where the book needs to get to go, and you need to hear it, listen, take it in, and it's not always a not your choice. You still have the artistic and creative choice, but I think if you put yourself in the hands of trusted mentors, trusted colleagues, the way I have with you all, um, you're 99% right. And so I have learned to defer to you in many ways, but that took some time and some back and forth, honestly.
Well, thank you for the kind words, and you've been very professional to work with, so that's made my job a lot easier. So thank you.
Mm.
So now that the novel is coming out, what do you want readers to take away from this? What are some of the themes they'll see in the novel, and ultimately, what do you want them both to learn and to feel when they put the book down?
Okay, well, I'm going to start with the ghosts. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, you can at least entertain the possibility that there might be ghosts. And so I think it's really important because they are metaphor for things beyond our control in this world, and metaphor for sometimes the world lands on you in ways that are unexpected and unpleasant. So I think that's the first thing, is don't shy away, because this truly is um, a Southern Gothic family saga. It is very literary in the way that it is written. And so I think it really will speak to a broad range of audiences that might not just clue in solely based on checking a box around genre or solely checking a box around paranormal, yes or no. So that's one thing, is give it a chance. That would be my first hope as the book comes out. The second is, this is a very personal tale, as all books are. I think there's much of the author. There's no character in here who is me. There's no character in here who is A, B, C, or D in my family either, but they are amalgams of people I have loved and people I have lost in this world. And, I was pushed one time to say, so what's the grand thought of this? And it is a love letter to a place I love, which is Texas, and more specifically, the Texas Hill Country. And it's a love letter to this quirky little place called Bandera, Texas, which I just think has a lot to offer in terms of a crucible of the American experience. And so when I think about this, I think there are many universal themes of uh, immigration, assimilation, belonging, your relationship with God, how that manifests and unravels perhaps over time, and then just the hardness of family and people you love who fail you, people who love who stumble, and how you continue to pick yourself up from the ashes and go on. And I think those are universal themes that come throughout this book. And it is ultimately a story of love and hope, but it's a really hard path to get there. And I think that that's a pretty universal set of themes that will resonate with lots of readers.
And after going through all this now, this years long process, are you excited for the next step? Are you working on something new? Where are you headed from here?
I'm not ready to shake Bandera loose. There are so many stories that I uncovered in my research that have not yet been told as part of this book. And so, yes, I have actually cracked. I keep notes in a moleskin uh, journal, and I have cracked the binding on one on a next novel that I hope to finish in the coming year or so.
Well, Julia, congratulations on the Wretched and Undone. It's already getting some really great reviews, and that's just great to see. And thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.